everyone, and welcome to this video. My name is Susan O'Byrne, and today we're going to talk about how to avoid sprawling sentences. Here, I mean sentences that emerge when writers try to fit in too many ideas at once, when they don't articulate those ideas very well, when they lose track of which ideas they want to focus on, and when they use too many words to get those ideas across. A sprawling sentence can overwhelm your reader, confuse them, and make them mentally switch off. So what we're going to do in this video is look at some tips to help you ensure structure and clarity in the sentences you write. Okay, we're going to kick things off with a task, and it's a fairly simple one. On the next slide, I'm going to show you a sentence. All I want you to do is pause the recording and read that sentence out loud. And afterwards, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Okay, so here's our sentence. Pause the recording here and read this sentence out loud. Then come back when you're ready. Okay, welcome back. So now I'm going to ask you those questions. The first question then, while you were reading that sentence, did you begin to run out of breath anywhere? Now, if you're anything like me, you will have begun to run out of breath somewhere during that sentence, and more likely than not, it was towards the end of this part highlighted in blue. And that's important because any time you read a text out loud and you find yourself running out of breath, it usually means that anybody reading the text normally is going to be mentally overwhelmed at the same stage. Okay, our second question then. While reading this sentence, did you begin to trip up anywhere? Was there any point while you were reading that you found yourself having to stop and start again? Again, if you're anything like me, you will have begun to trip up at some point. And the most likely stages are probably at these relative clauses, which are highlighted. Now, this is another important point, because if you read a text out loud, and you do find yourself tripping up like this, there's a good chance that anyone reading the text normally will be mentally tripping up, having to stop and start again, and going back and rereading from an earlier point in the sentence. One of the best tips I can give you then is to read your own writing out loud to yourself, because that's an excellent way of identifying problems. If you begin to run out of breath while you read out loud, it means that you need to rewrite so as not to mentally overwhelm your readers. And if you begin to trip up while you read out loud, that means that you need to rewrite so as not to trip up your readers. Okay, so reading out loud helped us establish that there are problems with this sentence. But what are those problems exactly? Well, that's what we're going to turn our attention to now. What I'd like you to do here is to pause the recording, read through the sentence, and try to pinpoint a few things about this sentence that make it difficult to read. Then, when you're finished, come back and we'll compare notes. Okay, so pause here and come back when you're ready. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you were able to come up with some ideas about what makes this sentence a difficult read. Now, I'll take you through some of mine. The first issue then is that it takes forever to get to the subject due to the long introductory phrase. The introductory phrase is highlighted in blue here and the subject in bold. Now, in an English active sentence, the subject is where the sentence really starts going, where all the important things start happening. So we expect to get to the subject fairly quickly. And if we take too long to get to the subject, the reader may either feel overwhelmed with all the information that comes first, or grow impatient and frustrated. The next problem is that the main clause begins with a long, weak, abstract subject. Now, in a previous lesson, you learnt about concrete and abstract subjects. And you may remember that abstract subjects can make it difficult for readers to visualize what's going on in the sentence, or even make them mentally switch off. Next up, we have the problem that a nominalization governs the sentence. Again, nominalizations were something you learned about in a previous lesson. So hopefully you should be able to identify that the word consideration is a nominalization here. And remember that as a general rule, it's better to use active verbs rather than nominalizations wherever possible, because active verbs are far more likely to add vitality and vigor to your writing and to keep your readers engaged. Yet another issue with our sentence is that there are interruptions between the subject and the verb, and between the verb and the object. So here we can see that our subject, future research into the effects of driverless vehicles, our verb, should also take into consideration, and our object, the assorted broader ramifications of driverless technology, are interrupted by the relative clauses highlighted here in blue. Now in English, the subject, verb and object are generally the main parts of an active sentence, and as readers we expect those things to be fairly close to one another. And we can get confused if they aren't. So these interruptions are the reasons that you may have found yourself tripping up when you read the sentence out loud at the start of this lesson. Our next problem is that there are just too many relative clauses, as you can see highlighted here in blue. Now, when you find yourself with too many relative clauses in your sentence, that's probably a sign that you've begun to lose focus, and you're overloading your readers by trying to fit too many ideas into one place. And it is most definitely a sign that your sentence has begun to sprawl and lose its shape. The final problem with this sentence that I want to highlight is that it contains a lot of redundancy. So, from the earlier lesson that we had on redundancy, you may have noticed that we have some modifiers, highlighted here in blue, that we could actually do without. And a lot of the wording in this sentence is either repetitive or just plain unnecessary, and I've highlighted this text in blue. Now, if we highlight both the redundant modifiers and the repetitive/unnecessary wording, we can see that a lot of the text in this sentence is actually redundant. So what I would like you to do here is to pause the recording, read through the sentence again, and work out why the text highlighted in blue is redundant. Okay, so pause here and then come back when you're ready. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you were able to identify why a lot of that text was redundant. Now I'm going to underline the point for you by simply removing the redundant wording. So, as you can see here, if we simply delete the redundant wording we highlighted earlier, we have a fairly serviceable sentence that carries more or less the same meaning as the original, reading alongside the impacts that driverless cars may have on the road. Research should take into consideration the legal, moral, economic and social implications. So hopefully this underlines for you, again, the importance of eliminating redundancy to avoid burying your point under a stack of unnecessary text. Okay, so now that we've highlighted what can go wrong, let's run through some tips that will help you avoid sprawling sentences. First, be sure to keep introductory phrases concise where possible, so that you don't take too long to get to the subject. Next, use concrete subjects and action verbs wherever possible to keep your readers engaged. Keep the subject, verb and object close together so as to not confuse the reader by breaking up the most natural order of a sentence. And finally, eliminate redundancy to avoid making your reader work too hard to find the point that you want to make. Okay, so now that you have the tips for avoiding sprawling sentences, let's put them into practice. Here we have our tips on the left and our original sprawling sentence on the right. For our last task, I'd like you to pause the recording here and rewrite the sentence according to the tips. Okay, so pause here and then come back when you're ready. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you were able to come up with a sentence that you're happy with. Now I'll show you one possible answer. So here we have a sentence which reads, alongside the impacts that driverless cars may have on the road, researchers should consider the legal, moral, economic and social implications. And I hope that you agree that this version is a lot better structured, as well as being clearer, more concise and more vigorous, while still retaining the same basic information as the original. Well, that brings us to the end of this video. All that remains is for me to say thank you very much for watching and on to the next task.